Good morning and welcome to the February 12th, 2018 workshop of the Orlando City Council. Today we're going to focus on public safety. It's always a top priority for the City Council and this municipal government. As we continue to grow, we continue to evaluate best practices for all of our departments, and we want to make sure that we operate in the most efficient manner while providing the highest level of services. So over the last year, the fire department has taken a review of their best practices and benchmarking departments from around the country. Obviously, we've been changing the model for our transport services for EMT. We're looking at that moving forward. So today we have a presentation on a new model that we're taking a look at. Chief?
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Council. Good morning, guests. Again, as you stated earlier, Mayor, we have been around 132 years in this community. In the last 6.5 years, we've been transporting in the city of Orlando, and our transport model has been very good for our citizens. We had a dual partnership with our third-party provider. But as I became chief, I began to look at some of the things that we do in transport and how can we make this model more efficient and better for our citizens, better for our firefighters who are in training. So today's presentation is just that. It's to talk about the efficiency of this model. How do we go forward as a city to best serve our citizens? So I hired Fitch & Associates a year ago to look at our data, to look at how we're doing business, can we do it better, and benchmarking other departments. So today I'll turn it over to Ian Womack and Fitch & Associates, allow them to introduce themselves and tell you exactly where we see the fire department going forward in the 21st century.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Chief. I'd like to thank the Commission for having us here this morning. We're excited to be here. It's a privilege to present the findings of a long study, a very detailed study to the policymakers. But I just want to start with a brief introduction myself. My name is Ian Womack. I'm a senior associate with Fiscal Associates. I come out of the fire-based EMS world, run an EMS system for a metro-sized fire department. And I have two of our firm partners with us today, Dr. Stephen Knight, retired assistant chief out of the fire-based EMS systems, and then our other partner, Guillermo Fuentes. And if I could just real quick give you a background on the Fitch firm as a whole. As a consulting firm, we've been in EMS consulting, law enforcement, fire for better than 30 years on a national scale and an international scale. Two things that make our firm special, especially being able to present what we're going to present to you today, is we're very data-driven. Data is very objective. It's very reliable. It's very predictable. So we always like to apply first a very objective, data-driven approach to everything we do, a very quantitative analysis. And then once that quantitative analysis is done, we always circle back around and lay a qualitative layer on it to make sure it makes sense. And so that's really our approach across all of our projects, and that's what we utilized here for this project. I also want to share with you that not only do we work in the consulting side, but we also work in the management side. So as a firm, we manage large systems, transport systems, ambulance systems, hospital-based EMS systems. And the same practices that we use in our recommendations for communities like yours are things that we actually employ in our own business model very successfully. So, you know, what we're going to present to you isn't theoretical. These are tried and tested approaches to handling large demand systems like you have here in Orlando. And if I could just, one more little side point. We've only got about 26, 27 slides. Just for the sake of flow and time, if you have a question that can wait till the end, if you could just maybe jot it down, I'll be glad to address all your questions at the end. And that way we can just kind of slide through. Some of those questions, you might find them answered through the presentation, so it may save you some of the trouble. All right, so the first thing we wanted to just talk about is the baseline of where the community's at right now. So we harvested all the available data from the CAD to look at what your current response profile looks like. What is the community service demand driven from? And as you can see, 81.4% of the demand is EMS. That's not unusual. If you look across the country, since the fire service started to venture into EMS in the early 70s, EMS has continued to become a larger driver of the services that we supply. You can see that the fire-related side of the house is only about 13.8%, and that breaks down to about 7.9% are fire alarms, 1.9% are public assist, and then structure fires are your actual building fires, 1.3%. That breakdown, too, mirrors very closely with the national trend. And that's really a testament to the work that the industry has done, right? So a lot of effort has been placed into prevention and mitigation, building codes, inspection, enforcement of those codes. You know, we're teaching every child in school how to be fire safe, and it's really done a tremendous job of lowering the demand on the fire side of the house. Unfortunately, we haven't quite found the magic bullet for EMS yet. We haven't figured out how to stop aging or stop population growth, and those are two big drivers for EMS. If anybody figures that out, let me know. I'd like to invest in that. But for now, we just have to figure out how to address the growth as it's occurring, and that's what's occurring here in your community. I want to point something out on the table. You'll see the table here. We track number of calls and number of responses. Number of calls is simply the number of incidents that occur. So a 911 call comes in, that generates a single incident, that counts as one. That incident may require 1 unit or 7 units or anything in between to mitigate. So the number of units that go to that incident are what the responses are. So that's why you'll see number of calls was 57,147, but the number of responses was 127,000. Those were the unit movements that went to those incidents to answer the call. I want to point one more thing out on this slide before we move forward, and it's really a kudos to the organization and what OFD has built as a community and as a service delivery, that they respond to 99.9% of their own incidents. So we call that reliability. It's the ability of an agency to handle their demand independently or without relying on automatic aid or mutual aid or something like that. Most agencies strive for 90% reliability, and we consider that excellent. So at 99.9%, you guys are actually at the tip of the spear of excellence nationally with a 99.9% reliability. The big takeaway for you on that is you're able to handle the needs of your community independent of your partners. So not being overly relying upon your partners means that whatever changes they make isn't going to negatively impact your community service delivery, which is excellent. Your citizens can rely 100% on OFD to do it. So 99.9% of the time, an OFD unit is represented on an incident that comes from an OFD, an Orlando citizen or visitor. So your historical performance, there's really, we want to really focus in on travel time. And that's really a big number for us because travel time is related directly to how you lay out your resources or distribute your resources. So the idea is to pepper the city with enough resources, enough locations that we can assure a certain amount of travel time. And that's kind of how you lay out your distribution of resources. So we wanted to look at what the historical performance was to understand moving forward that every plan that we would develop, and the one we're going to present to you today, would at a minimum maintain your performance. We didn't want to do anything that would degrade service to the community at the level they're already experiencing. We also measure travel time. We measure performance at the 90th percentile instead of an average. And the reason we do that is when we're designing a 911 system delivery, we want it to be very reliable and dependable and assured. An average can have a lot of variability in it, right? So if you call 911 and I respond to one incident in 10 minutes and another incident in 2 minutes, the average is 6 minutes. So it grossly overstates one person's experience and grossly understates another person's experience. When we measure to the 90th percentile, what we're saying is 9 times out of 10, we will meet your demand at this performance level or better. So at the 90th percentile for the agency, their EMS responses are about 7.2 minutes travel time. That means 90% of the time, or 9 times out of 10, an OFD constituent is getting an EMS response in 7.2 minutes travel time or better. Now there's a whole big lot of calls that are in that 4 and 5 minute mark. But we can assure them that 9 times out of 10, that's the performance they'll get. And then fires at 8.5 minutes, not unusual that fires a little longer. You know, those apparatus are a little more cumbersome to move. They're not as agile. The whole process of responding on the fire side is a little bit more complex. So overall, when we aggregate that all together, the system performance is about 7.4 minutes based on the 2016 data. Excuse me. As we got into the data, we had started to identify some challenges that we wanted to make sure we addressed with the plans that we put forward. So the workload is a challenge, and there's 2 things I really want to draw on here, and we'll reemphasize it a little bit later. But EMS is the primary driver. It's not a surprise. We just talked about it being better than 81% of the demand. What you see before you is a table that details the experience hour by hour of the day over the entire day. So the 0 in your bottom axis represents the midnight hour, and then you see the 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and you move through the 24-hour period of the day as you flow to the right on the graph. The chart itself, the graph, the bars, the blue portion is EMS, the red portion is fire, and the green portion is those specialty incidents. So what you immediately start to see is at about the 8 o'clock hour, demand starts to sharply increase. And then it holds high throughout the day until it starts to taper off in the evening. That's just a simple reality of when everybody's tucked in at bed at home, right, there tends to be less need for help and emergency response. During the daytime, we all get up, we go out, we start to engage in our day. The city swells as people come in for work or tourism or whatever, so it drives demand during the high time of the day. And we call that the peak time of the day. What's excellent about this type of analysis is it's very predictable and it's very reliable. So we can duplicate that experience day over day over day. So from a planning standpoint, it's a great tool for us because we have such a high level of reliability in that analysis. You can see on the fire side, it's not a big contributor. As we talked about before, very small portions. So citywide, the fire averages about 1.3 calls per hour during the peak time of the day. And citywide, the EMS is about 7.2 calls per hour during the peak time of the day. And then the department, because of some of the way the responses are, is over-resourcing some responses that impact those numbers. And we're going to talk about some strategies that can be utilized to adjust some of that over-resourcing on the EMS side and introduce capacity back into the system and efficiency. So when we talk about workload, I just want to lay a little foundation for what we're talking about. We're doing more than just counting calls. That can leave us with a very elementary understanding of what the workload is, simply because if you ran a call out of one station and it only took 10 minutes, but another station ran a call and it took 20 minutes on average, their 1-for-1 isn't an equal comparison. So when we measure workload, we actually want to measure the time a unit spends on mission. And that really means the time it gets dispatched till the time it goes available. That's the time it's been on mission. We take all that time over its deployed shift, so in this case, 24 hours for how OFD's current deployment works, and we aggregate together all that time that truck spends on the mission, and that gives us what we call a unit hour utilization. That tells us how much time they're actually on task, on mission. Now, what's commonly thought of is if I'm paying for a unit for 24 hours, then its utilization should be 100%, right? I want to get what I'm paying for. But when you're talking about emergency readiness and deployment, it's not a practical approach. If a unit's utilization runs at 100%, then that means it's always on an incident response. So you have no availability for the next 911 call that comes in. Everybody's busy. So at the start, you have to drop down some of that utilization to make sure that there's enough reliability that when somebody calls 911, there is a unit available in close enough proximity to meet their needs in an acceptable level of time. On top of that, we have to account for all the other ancillary work that occurs throughout a shift. It's a 24-hour deployment or tour. So there's equipment to be maintained, to be cleaned. There's significant amount of training that has to be accomplished. There's rest, recovery, restock. It's a 24-hour period. There needs to be some sleep time in there as well. Eating, we have to fuel up at least a couple times over the 24-hour period. We always joke that EMS was why they invented the microwave, because when EMS introduced us, suddenly we started reheating a lot of our meals. So. But because of all those things, there's only so much you can work a unit. What the research is showing and the industry is showing is about, for a 24-hour unit, at about a 30% workload is a threshold that when agencies start to exceed that, there starts to be a degradation in performance. So when units are bumping over 30%, that means about 8 hours of their 24-hour period on a call. You start to see a reduction or an increase in response times, a reduction in reliability, but there's also a human aspect to that. You actually start to see an impact, a negative impact on the providers themselves. The clinical decision-making of a paramedic being able to calculate a pediatric drug dose at 2 a.m. when they've been running like crazy all day long is much more challenging than fresh at the start of a shift, when the workload's just starting out. So that 30% threshold is really an appropriate limit by industry best practice. You'll see the table here details out the units within the agency. All but 5 units are below that industry standard threshold, so that's excellent. There's capacity in the agency already that can be leveraged to address the EMS growth. But what also has to happen is the agency is going to need to address those units that are at that threshold or just above, because it's unsustainable. And what we'll present to you in this deployment model will address that, both reducing those units below the threshold, but also equalizing the workload. So as you see here, there's not one section carrying most of the water, and then there's a ton of capacity left unleveraged in the other side. You'll see that not all the OFD units are covered in the chart. So the chart only goes to the 10% utilization, so the other 18 units aren't included in the chart you see simply because they're below that 10% utilization, or 2.4 hours per day. Another challenge the agency is facing is transport. So currently the agency transports about 61% of the EMS calls that come in, so that's about 28,000 transports a year. They rely on a private third-party provider, American Medical Response, to handle about 7,700 of those transports. The way it's set up now is the BLS side of the demand. The challenge with the private side is that's a very unpredictable market on the ambulance side. So that 7,700 call volume on the American Medical Response side is a very difficult model from a business aspect for that agency to sustain and to stay viable. So it puts the OFD at a little bit of a decision point of do they supplement that? Do we try to give more calls to AMR, but then that impacts OFD's bottom line on the revenue side? Do we assume all that workload? I mean, that's really the challenge in moving forward. The focus for us is to build a system that's sustainable and can be resilient to that type of a challenge in the future. So I just wanted to share with you some of the modeling that we did to look at all aspects of how the agency operates. And one of the things we always like to give you a look at is what would NFPA 1710 look like, which says a 4-minute travel time 90% of the time. It's very difficult for a community to meet that, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But the way the modeling works is it takes all the historical calls that occurred in that 2016 period, and then it lays out the stations as they currently exist and says how well we were able to capture all those calls with our current station locations and all the calls where they occurred. And you can see here that in a 4-minute travel time with your current station location, you were only able to capture about 61% of the incidents within a 4-minute travel time. That means 39% of your incidents occur at a location that's greater than 4 minutes of travel from your current fire stations. So if as a community you said, you know what, we're committed to 4 minutes travel, we want to invest in that, what would that look like? So that's where we give you an optimized 4-minute travel time. So what this analysis does is it says if you could start from scratch, I mean, as a community planner, wouldn't it be neat to build your community from scratch, like from the start, right? Usually you guys are inheriting decisions that were made well ahead of you and before growth occurred in one spot or another. But this approach is a 30,000-foot liftoff, and we say, okay, if we had to build the fire protection services and EMS services for OFD from scratch at a 4-minute response time, what would it take? So this optimizes the station locations, puts them in the best position to capture the most amount of calls in that 4-minute travel time, 90% of the time. And when we optimize that, it still requires 33 fire stations to accomplish it. That's based off of your current road network and where your current demand exists. So at 17 stations now, that would nearly double the OFD budget. An optimized 17 station plan, so if you could take your 17 stations, uproot them, and just move them to more optimal locations, could still only achieve about 75%. So it's a very, very difficult goal to reach. Fitch has not encountered an agency yet nationally that's meeting 4-minute travel 90% of the time, especially an urban metro system like yours. We ran the modeling at a 7-minute travel time too, because if you recall, your historical performance is very close to that 7-minute travel time. So this really gives us a good indication of how we can cover the district at a 7-minute travel time. So really 10 station locations meet 90%, and that aligns closely with what the department's performance is, so it helps us to validate the modeling that we're using moving forward. And it also gives us a little bit more of a protective layer on the deployment plan, knowing that we can maintain that current performance to those life-threatening emergencies with the model that we're recommending. And again, I just want to emphasize, one of our driving goals is to make sure we maintain current performance at its current level or improve it. We ran an 8-minute model because this is going to relate to the transport side. So today, your citizens are getting that EMS response for all their life-threatening emergencies at that 7.2 minutes. That's going to be maintained in the plan that we're presenting. NFPA 1710 shows that ALS can be at 8 minutes as long as you have another layer performing faster in front of that. So you have that current performance at 7.2 minutes. We're going to maintain that. And then what we look at to maximize your transport capabilities is deploy those units at an 8-minute model. And you can see that with 6 locations, you can deploy your transport services and reach 90% of your incidents within 8 minutes, 90% of the time, with only 6 locations. And that's really, that'll play into when we start talking about the peak units and how we prioritize where to put those units to maximize their use. And that's really where we get this analysis from, where to put those trucks is from this 8-minute analysis. Some thoughts on staffing schedules. And I teased it a little bit earlier when we were talking about workload, was the peak demand of the shift. So this is the same chart that you saw earlier that shows the high demand part of the day. Typically the community peak here, as you see for Orlando, is between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. And so our recommendation is that you consider peak load staffing. And really the driver for that is twofold. The workload is going to continue to increase. Generally, the needs of a system outpace the availability of resources. So, you know, we draw a difference. It's the difference between being laser guided with your approach as opposed to just blanket spread out an approach. So if you were to buy a 24-hour unit to address workloads, you're going to add capacity to the daytime. That's great. But you're purchasing hours overnight where you don't have a workload challenge. So you're not being as laser guided focused with the available resources that you might have to leverage. The peak load approach purchases hours purely for the part of the day that's in need of them. So you're able to have a bigger impact with those peak load units. And I'll show you how, even on a workload side, you can have a bigger impact with those as well. But for that to be effective, I want to be very clear. That 24-hour, that 24-48 deployment you have right now, that base layer, has to stay in place. So that's what's providing you the guarantee of maintaining that service delivery at 7.2 minutes. What we're doing with the peak load is not replacing any of that. We layer the peak load on top to address that growth in demand and that extra workload that happens during the day. And so that is what bolsters up and makes that 24-hour deployment model you have successful. One of the things we looked at for the agency too was optimized personnel staffing. So one of the biggest challenges for a fire department is to figure out how many bodies to employ to meet their deployment. So what we use is we use a mathematical approach. Again, we're very objective, data-driven. So we use the data, we use a mathematical approach to calculate what are the optimal number of bodies to be employed to deploy all the apparatus for the agency for the day. And what that takes into account is simply how many hours have to be covered based off of what your average work week is by your labor agreement. And then what is the average leave that's used? So we want to account for the time when people are off on vacation or sick leave or funeral leave or emergency leave. We roll all those numbers in there, and in the end, it gives us what we call a relief staffing multiplier. So you can see the 24-48 schedule is an average 48-hour work week. So that would require 4.18 full-time employees to cover one seat. So just to illustrate, if an engine had 4 seats you wanted to fill every day, that would be 4 times 4.18, or how many people you would have to employ to deploy that unit every day. You see, for the peak load schedule, an average 42-hour work week, that would require 2.4 FTEs per seat. So just as a quick comparison, let's use a 24-hour rescue. A 24-hour rescue has 2 seats that need to be filled every day. So on the 24-48 schedule, that would be the 2 seats times 4.18 personnel. The peak load rescue, since it's only deploying for 12 hours, would be 2 seats times the 2.4 personnel. So you start to see some of the efficiencies with addressing the growth just by the number of people it takes to staff that unit up. We want to show you how that can translate into potential savings for the agency. You'll see the table at the top. Minimum staffing. I want to lay the foundation for what we're talking about when we refer to minimum staffing. There's a number that the agency starts with every day as a goal for how many bodies we need to have at work for the day to deploy the model, and that's what's called minimum staffing. Minimum staffing isn't always related to how many people you employ. It's just what operationally they've determined they need to have on duty at the start of each day to get all the units out the door. Presently, the agency has set its minimum staffing at 130. So their goal every day is to get to 130. They will hire back overtime anytime that number dips below 130. The table you see, if minimum staffing is set at 130 and we apply the staffing multiplier, that would require the agency employ 543 firefighters to meet a minimum staffing of 130. They currently have only 510 budgeted positions. So the minimum staffing set at 130 puts them in the hole of 33 people for the deployment. If you broke that over 3 days, it's about 11 people in the hole every day. So when you look at the agency's overtime cost, in the year we analyzed, their overtime cost was nearly $5 million. So when the minimum staffing set at 130, but there's only enough people employed, you know, you're 33 people short on the employment side, the overtime cost in that underemployment for the minimum staffing is highly correlated. So one of the recommendations we're asking the agency to look at is if they simply adjust their minimum staffing down to 122. And the difference of that is there's 8 engines every day that deploy with 4 people, all the rest of the engines deploy with 3. So if they were to adjust their minimum staffing down to 122, they'd still have 4 in every truck, they'd still have 5 in the heavy rescue, but just that adjustment would bring their minimum staffing down, and it would align it with the number of people that are actually employed. So all that overtime cost that's being spent every day to artificially hire up to the 130 is savings realized by the agency. We believe that can provide a potential savings of up to $2 million annually in your overtime cost. Another opportunity is as we equalize the workload with the deployment model, and some of these units see their workload decrease, there could be an opportunity to realize a reduction of a single unit cost as well. So if you aggregate those two, some of those potential savings could be $3.7 million. We want to talk about the agency leveraging what's called medical priority dispatch systems. That's what the MPDS is. What medical priority dispatch is it's a program that started to present itself in EMS back in 1985. It's been around for a very long time. It's just a matter of prioritizing or triaging the call or the incident at the point that the call is taken. So you have dispatchers that are highly trained in a protocol system, and they take the caller through an interrogation process, anywhere about 4 to 7 quick inquiries. And based on the answers to those questions, the dispatcher follows an algorithm that drills down to how serious the 911 call is that's actually being made. So for instance, you call 911, dispatcher answers, I have back pain. Boom, you just started. How long have you had back pain? 3 weeks. You just dropped over to a whole nother tree that it starts to get less and less urgent. If your back pain, it just started, I was sitting at rest, it's excruciating, I feel like there's a knife in my back, I can't breathe, you just jumped over to a very high priority. It's just a very brief series of questions. The interrogation process takes less than 60 seconds, and it allows you to drill down to what you're going to much more accurately before you even send a unit. What's neat about what OFD has is your comm center is currently accredited with medical priority dispatch. That means the communication center has fully implemented medical priority dispatch. They're hitting all the best practice benchmarks for it as far as its accuracy, its quality assurance, its case review, and they're drilling down to what that determinant is for acuity of the call. But that's not translating to the street. The agency's still dispatching how they traditionally have, so an EMS call comes in, they automatically dispatch the closest engine or truck and the closest rescue. So 2 units are going essentially to every call. So you're not leveraging that medical priority dispatch that you have in the comm center and applying it to your deployment on the street. So as a result, the OFD is averaging 1.9 unit responses per EMS call. What that represents is an unnecessary redundancy in resources. So when we talk about over-resourcing calls, that's really over-resourcing calls. What comes with that is 2 impacts. Every time the agency runs lights and sirens, there's risk associated with that for the city, the individuals on the unit responding, and the community itself. An emergency response increases the hazards of the road. So when you're sending 2 units to a call that maybe didn't need to, you're increasing the risk all around when you're doing that. Also what happens is when you're sending units to a call they don't need to go to, you're reducing your readiness on the backside. So if an engine and a rescue are going to a back pain that's 4 weeks old and non-emergent, you've reduced your suppression readiness by sending a suppression apparatus on a call perhaps it never needed to go on. So over-prioritization of calls, as we mentioned here, reduces the reliability of the fire suppression readiness, and it adds to the risk assumed by the agency and the community. So we wanted to show the agency what it would look like if they fully implemented medical party dispatch down to how they respond, not just so translate it from what's happening in the comm center down to actually altering the response approach. So we took 2016, took all the medical determinants that had gone through the medical party dispatch protocol, and determined what the department's experience would have been had they been dispatching according to medical party dispatch. And one thing I just want to mention before we start talking about how that would lay out. Medical party dispatch is controlled, those protocols are controlled by your medical director. So every protocol that's used in that interrogation process, the doctor that's on the hook for how the community's needs are met signs off on it. So he would not sign off on something that was going to put his patients and his medical license at risk. So if we apply it to 2016, you'll see ALS engine or truck only would be our recommendation. You see the A, B, C, O. So that's how the priorities, the call acuities, they fall into a category. We call them alphas, bravos, charlies, deltas, echoes, and omegas. So there's 6 categories. As you work your way up the alphabet, it gets more severe. So obviously your alphas are your very low acuity, very non-emergent. Bravos, charlies, omegas. Omegas are generally your scheduled things, or they're call transfers, Somebody calls in from a nursing home and one of their patients needs to get into the ER to get some blood work done. That drops into an omega category. So your alpha, bravo, charlie, omegas are your low priority, your lower priority, typically non-life-threatening incidents. So the recommendation would be to send just an engine or truck to those low priorities that transport less than 50% of the time. And again, that predictability about how often the transport utilization occurs is data-driven, so it's a very reliable figure. Then we would send the rescue. We'd recommend sending the rescues to those same calls that transport greater than 50% of the time. That way the rescue is committed to a call that it's likely going to be utilized on, but we're not committing the rescue to a call that it's likely not going to be utilized on. And that approach maintains that 7.2-minute response time that you're experiencing now. And then for those very serious calls, the deltas and echoes, the life-threatening emergencies that are truly all hands on deck, that still gets the dual response. It gets the closest ALS engine or truck plus the closest rescue truck, so you have plenty of hands there to address the emergency. You make sure that you are providing your response as fast as possible because you have multiple units coming. And when you break all that down, the table you'll see at the bottom, the difference from FY16 to employee medical emergency dispatch. You can see your total engine and truck work would have been reduced by 24,857 responses. So that's 24,000 times the units in the station available for another call should it come in. Or that's what we call suppression readiness, right? That's also time and space for training, all those other ancillary things that come about. With this deployment plan as well, you can see that the rescue work would have only increased by 2,500 calls, but that's accounting for the fact that the agency's taken on 7,700 more transports they weren't doing before. So that 7,700 transport impact, we're able to soften the impact of the agency with that by being more strategic about what you send the rescue truck to. You're not sending it to calls it doesn't need to go to. And you'll see overall it moves your average EMS responses per call from 1.9 down to 1.4. So typically the national experience you see is about 1.2 to 1.4 is your average unit responses per EMS call. The biggest driver of that is, even when you're doing all this right, is vehicle crashes are set as EMS calls, and you always get a suppression unit and an ALS unit at a minimum, right? Because there's hazards to adjust as well as life emergencies. So it's hard to really ever drive it down to 1. So what we've recommended as the model for consideration, I just want to get back and key in on what drove us in this direction. We base everything on travel time and workload. Travel time deals with, again, how we distribute the resources through the community. And once we distribute those resources to ensure the travel time is met, we have to make sure we put enough resources in those locations to handle the workload. So it's really a 2-tiered approach. The plan we wanted to do is identify the ideal geographic locations inside your current footprint to maximize the resources you have now and those efficiencies. And the big drivers of our plans, whatever we did, we don't want to negatively impact your ISO and accreditation. The fact that the agency is ISO 1 and accredited puts your fire department in the top 1% of fire departments in the country. That's huge. There's very few agencies that are ISO 1, even fewer that are ISO 1 and internationally accredited. So the agency is excellent, and we don't want to impact that negatively at all. We also want to make sure we address the unit hour utilization by equalizing the workload. That's helping the agency leverage some of that capacity that does exist without necessarily having to buy more unit hours to address it. And then stabilize the transport model. Again, it's the 7,700 BLS transports for American Medical Response isn't a sustainable business model, so something's going to have to give there. To provide consistency, sustainability, reliability is what we wanted to make sure our plan did for the agency. And then obviously back to sustainability, not just on a workload side, but fiscally. Us introducing a plan that is unfundable, unfiscally sustainable, does you no good, it does nobody any good. So we always want to test our deployments to make sure that they're fiscally sustainable and they're easily growable if necessary. And that's what we've done with this model. So the recommended model will employ 6 peak units and keep your entire 24/48 deployment that you have now. So everything you have now stays in play, but we layer 6 peak units on top of that to address that heavy demand during the daytime and that growth. You'll see a staffing chart at the top of this slide. There's 2 lines I want to draw your attention to. The blue line represents our geographical deployment of units. So those are all the units in play that can cover workload. As the chart rolls from left to right, this is the entire week experience. So this is a 7-day run through of the week. So it starts with Sunday here at midnight, and you can see as your green bars valley up and down, those are going through the peak periods of each day of the week. So we see the green bar shows us what the call demand is, and then we layer the geographic units on that. And the key is if you don't want to be dipping into your geographical units so much, because if your demand gets so busy that you start pulling geographic units outside of their area, it's a domino effect, right? If there's a big blank space here because the geo units are getting pulled into other zones, and that starts to increase response time there. So the key is balancing out the geographic deployment with the workload deployment, so that the two, you see our staffing line with the red represents the full staffing above the geographic units. And you see how that red line runs close with the blue line, but it never quite touches? That's ideal. That means that what we're proposing to deploy here will maintain that geographic readiness model so that 7.2 minutes doesn't go away, but you're able to address all the peaks and valleys of the demand side and even have surge capacity for those surge days that you just can't predict that happen in the system. I want to pull you down to the table below, and you'll see we've separated out the experience for both the peak units and the 24-hour units. And the estimated response, UHU, is what I want to draw your attention to, that column. So if you slide over to the 24-hour units, the right side of that table, the center column, estimated response, UHU, remember you had nearly 5 units that were at that threshold or above. What we anticipate with this model is all of your units will see their workload come down, and all the units now will experience about a 0.23 overall average workload. So those that were above the threshold or at it are going to come down to a very manageable level of 0.23, and those that had extra capacity will pick up some more work, and that equalizes the workload across. So that's when we talked about leveraging the resources you had to address the workload problem. And that's very sustainable. At a 0.23, it's sustainable for the personnel working the unit. It provides the unit space to take growth without you having to reinvest dollars to adjust that. You'll notice that the peak units, we have their estimated response UHU at a 0.50. And you're probably thinking, I just told you 30 was the threshold and I'm recommending 50. That's true. Both of those things are true. The reason you can work a peak unit, a 12-hour unit at 50% is it's only on duty for 12 hours. So you don't have to provide that capacity for sleep. You don't have to provide as much capacity for recovery. When you're only on duty for that 12-hour period, they check off, they go get a good night's sleep, they get rested, they get replenished to come back for the next day. So the industry sees that running those units at a 50% utilization doesn't have the negative impact that a 24-hour unit would at that same. When you start to get over 50%, you start to see those same effects of fatigue coming into play and degraded performance. So not only are you able to buy those unit hours only when you need them, but you can work those at a much higher level, so you're kind of getting a little bit more bang for your buck in those peak units. They're doing a lot of the heavy lifting throughout the day. And that'll provide capacity, again, for those 24-hour units to do some of the other things that they're very challenged to do right now, such as training, which is very important. So just the high points of the recommended model, it maintains the 7.2 minutes. I keep emphasizing that because it's important to understand that the service delivery to the community will stay as good as it is today. It achieves nearly 92% at 8 minutes for your ambulance responses. So the transport piece is very reliable. It has design surge capacity. So when I talked about having space to address those surges, it's very difficult to predict when surges happen, but some days come along and the system gets crazy, This has sufficient capacity to handle those surges without negatively impacting the performance. It stabilizes, equalizes the workload, as we mentioned. That helps to move those 24-hour units that are very stressed with their workload right now down to, like I said, that 0.23% overall utilization. And there's an opportunity for immediate general fund savings. So once you equalize that workload, again, you can reevaluate the deployment and you might see an opportunity to reduce the cost of a unit. Those savings in themselves will facilitate the cost of the peak load program investment. It's efficient, functional, and the big thing is it's easily scalable. So it's not a model that's going to require an immediate reinvestment from you once you deploy it. So it's going to buy you some time to watch it operate and to grow without having to reinvest dollars immediately in it again. Just to talk about what fiscally it looks like, because it's always, the money's the big one, right? Everybody's always like, just get to the money part, right? So we're here. This is the money part. The chart you're going to see here, I just want to explain what you're looking at. Every municipality or entity, they put their money and they do their accounting differently. So what we wanted to do is just show you from a personnel cost standpoint. Personnel is the biggest driver of cost for any service delivery model, period. So from a personnel cost standpoint, what does your current deployment look like versus what the new model would look like? These are just bodies in the seat. What does it take to put bodies in the seat? This doesn't really get into the weeds on which fund the money's coming out of or how it's generating from here or there. It's just to simply give you an apples-to-apples comparison. So we kind of took all that other minutia out and said, what does it take bodies-wise to deploy these two plans? So your current deployment has 11 24-hour rescues and 1 peak load rescue that's funded on overtime. And you can see the total cost for that personnel deployment is about $13.5 million. That model generates $5.8 million in revenue, so it leaves a negative balance of $7.7 million. Not unusual, all right? So fire-based EMS services, nobody's really killing it in the black on that, right? But that's what the community's adopted. That's the model you deploy. Our proposed plan maintains the 24-hour rescues at 11. We put 6 peak load rescues on there. Those are civilian rescues, single cert paramedic rescues. So your total personnel cost is now $15.2 million, but your revenues go up because that extra workload, those peak loads are picking up. They're at that 50% workload, so they're carrying a lot of EMS demand, which is generating more transport revenue for you. So in the end, you can see your financial balance, you're $7.2 million in the hole. So the financial position, strictly on a personnel to personnel comparison, is better with the new deployment plan than you're actually sitting right now. If you assume all the EMS workload, you have a potential to increase your revenues by 1.6 to 2.2 million on the collection side. And we give you that range simply because it's a matter of which analytics you want to apply to it. So we gave you both, and it's going to land somewhere there. We're rather confident you're going to be on the higher range of that, just understanding how the private side bills for those services. So this is a fiscal comparison that's based off of your EMS fund. So that's your EMS fund carries your administrative cost and your capital cost and your supply cost of the deployment plan. So when we say expenses probable, that's again us anticipating you're going to be able to see the higher range of that collection increase, and then expenses conservative. So there's a comparison to the right side of that table. You can see your FY16 current, and then what the experience would be if this plan was run commensurately with that same data set. So in the end, with what we anticipate your increased revenues can be, the difference from FY16 current, it puts you in about $177,000 better position than you were today. Now, if we took the very conservative approach to the collections you're $385,000 to the worse than you are today. But something to keep in the back of your mind. The challenge of maintaining the business partnership with the private provider could end up meaning reinvestment from the city to help subsidize that. We anticipate that even though the conservative estimate would put you $385,000 worse than you are today, that likely is still going to be more economical than helping to bolster up that private third-party service that isn't getting enough business in their current approach. The agency had already done an analysis of what it would take administratively to facilitate the program, and all we did was go through and validate the work. There's a highly talented team in play here at OFD. They know their business. They've been in the transport business long enough to understand it very well. They know their needs as far as administratively. So we reviewed the positions that they had in their proposal, and each of them had valid impact on the deployment model and were necessary. So our work here was to simply bolster that up and support that plan that they had already put together. That would include 6 new FTEs, 2 sworn, 4 civilian, and that comes at a cost of about $635,000, and that is already played into those analyses that you saw. The capital investment side, we wanted to see what it would take if you wanted to actually tool up new. There is capacity in the OFD fleet now to tiptoe into the peak load deployment with current resources. But if you wanted to tool up brand new across the board, it's a $1.2 million total commitment. That's about $330,000 in equipment cost and then $900,000 in vehicle cost. And what we simply did was we leveraged the Florida Sheriff's Cooperative Purchasing Contract and went with the pricing off of there for the type of an apparatus, a Type 3 ambulance that was typically used for simply just doing transports over again. They're a little bit more streamlined than what you would see for a fire-based EMS unit that has to carry fire gear and all that stuff on it too for your dual certs. These single cert units can be a little leaner, so that's why you see it at a capital cost of about $150,000. And again, just to reemphasize, adjusting your minimum staffing, what we talked about that could be realized in savings on the overtime side, could facilitate the cost of the capital investment as well, just depending on how you guys want to run that out. And I'm going to reintroduce the fire chief.
Good morning again. Thank you, Ian. Mayor, Council, again, as you heard the presentation, a couple things I want to point out to you is that when I looked at it, this hybrid system, far as the 11 sworn and the 24-hour rescues, is again dealing with peak units, dealing with the time, listen to the firefighters, understanding that at the end of the day, the firefighters have to be ready and prepared to respond to emergency calls, and our workload is going up so high that they are not as rested, as prepared, and fire training side is suffering. So we had to do something. I feel like we have to do something with this model, and this approach will allow us to address those needs, to guarantee the best services for our citizens. Again, we're an ISO accredited department, so we have things in place, but we must figure out a way to balance the workload and the transport model and give our citizens the best services that we give every day on the fire side. As we've stated, we handle 99.9% of all our calls now, and as the city grows, how do we keep up with that growth? Fiscally keep up with the growth. Cost reduction, how do we do it smart, safe for our personnel to be fiscally sustainable? And the second part is increasing diversity on this organization. As we look at it as our neighboring departments, some have 20% females on their department where OFD has 4. This new plan will allow us to increase the diversity on the department, to bring in more female minorities, just get people to get a chance to see who they are for 2 or 3 years, and then bring them over to the fire side eventually. Not a sole source, but it's another opportunity for us to increase the diversity on this organization. Again, but the most important is under our purview. The city of Orlando is maintaining, operating, and controlling these individuals, not relying on a third-party vendor to treat our citizens. So it's very important. And last but not least, no firefighters will be laid off in this plan. Our goal is to increase services. We added the tower truck this year with 12 new sworn firefighters, an additional specialty unit coming next year. And as the growth comes up, we're putting in smart goals, smart objectives, so we can keep up with growth without exceeding it. So this plan allows us to do just that, to meet the demand and meet it effectively and efficiently. So thank you again for hearing me out, and I'll entertain any questions.
Thank you, Chief. Very good presentation. So much of what we're doing more data-driven than ad hoc, not just in fire, but every department in the city. And it validates some of the things that we're doing when we can use the numbers to say this is the approach we ought to take. Commissioner Stewart.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Ian. Thank you, Chief. The challenge, it seems to me, is that we have a significant amount of overtime now to address the current demand levels that we have. And is it overly simplistic to say that by employing a new model, we'll be able to reduce that overtime in such a way that we can add, you call it civilian, but add civilian and still maintain the workload, the peak workload for where we're currently moving and where the growth of the city is. Is that correct?
Yeah, the key to that would be adjusting that minimum staffing number.
All right. By changing the minimum staffing, changes what our impact is on overtime, and then we supplement that peak hour with, what's a PLU?
A peak load unit. That's just an abbreviation for it, yeah.
You keep going through a couple.
I thought I pulled all those out of there.
Well, that's a PLU. All right, so does that seem, I'm not being overly simplistic, is it that
No,
kind
sir.
of where you're going? I've got a couple of individual questions I want to ask you about. So, but one of them is on page 16. Whoop. Maybe it's not on page 16. Nope, it's not on page 16. Let me go back. Page 21. I'm looking at the math of it. So in the math of how you do it, how did you calculate the estimated response, the UHU?
Okay, so we tier out what their experience would be, and we separate out the two workloads, both the response workload and then the transport workload, by what the agency's historical performance is. So through that 2016 data, we know how much time they're spending average per response and how much time they're spending average when there's a transport. So we simply take those averages and apply it to how many calls they can take a day until we sneak them up to that 50% utilization, and then we draw the line there. So we back into it based off the historical performance.
So that data is not an accumulation of data that's there. It comes from a different source?
Correct.
That's what I'm trying to understand. Because 71 divided by 264 is not 0.21. That's what I was looking at, those choices there.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So that comes from another source that you're bringing back into there. Which,
Yeah, it doesn't aggregate. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good.
Or some.
And then it always is confusing me in terms of transport, the higher priority cases. But I think probably the key that I hear you say is that we're in the midst of when somebody calls in, we're already really deciding whether it's an Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, A, B, C, D, E, and O, I guess. Is that right?
Yep.
We're already deciding that.
Yes.
And we're doing that, but we're dispatching our two vehicles out to the call.
Correct.
They just know more information when they arrive there.
Correct.
So your system would allow us to dispatch a little bit differently in order to still maintain a dispatch travel time and still accomplish the task of getting quality service to our citizens.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the last one is 23. It goes back. We're making an additional. Your suggestion is to make an additional investment in staff and cost, but by having us respond differently, we'll be able to have increased revenues, better billing, I guess. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, your billing will stay the same, but you're picking up more transport
Right.
work.
So the percentage.
Right.
I mean, the assumption is we're not getting more.
Yes.
Okay.
And we did, just as a side note, in case it's on everybody else, we did go back and look at your collection rate and billing. We wanted to be sure the agency was maximizing that, and it's on par with what you would expect for what your payer.
It seems about normal.
Yeah.
Okay. And then 24, the last one is based upon your probable and conservative. What you're basically saying is that it's really about revenue neutral.
When you get down into it,
I mean, between the two,
yeah.
I mean, you've got a
It's going to be very close.
positive and probable and negative in the others, and it's really revenue neutral, but it maintains a high quality of service that we want.
Correct. Yeah.
I love the idea of having people, I would say civilians, in the process that we get a chance to work with and have an idea to move them into, the same quality that we have in our current union.
Mm-hmm.
But I am concerned about the training of that. I guess we talked about that briefly with staff. I am concerned about training because they come to us now out of a school. So how, I guess, Chief, probably, I don't know how you address that, but I would like to see us at least look at some of those alternatives. You got somebody who's doing, I guess, EMS work, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And we want to move him into fire and EMS?
Yes.
I mean, the idea is that I think you'd have to take him out of service to go to fire school today. Is that what you have to do?
Right. If almost like a non-certified class. If we get to a point where this individual is selected to go to the next phase, they will go through the same standard classes through Valencia, whatever school we chose a partnership with. But EMS, our EMS division will do the day-to-day training with them, the same certification as all the medics and EMTs will have that upholds. So as far as the fire side of it, we rely on our partners in the community to do their part. And then our training division, once they get through that process, they go through our same rigorous tests, orientation for 6 weeks, and then they come on board. Yeah. But we're talking years down the line right now.
So it's a 6 weeks class that we have, a 6 week class?
Well, the class itself, standards is months, but once they get through that process, they come through our orientation, which is another 6 week, where we actually give more intensive training through our training division. But along the way, they will be monitored, evaluated from our lieutenants, chiefs in the field to make sure these individuals are even qualified to even go to the next level.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, I know I'm getting in the weeds, but the idea is that today that's not one of our issues because they're not on staff because they're in school, where they either paid for it individually or
right.
much like the police do.
Yeah, our current process
they
right now.
come to us with a certain level of standard. Now
That's
the guys
correct.
are going to come to us with a different level of standard, and we want to move them forward.
I want to make sure I emphasize this is not the only way. What I'm saying is that this is another conduit which to increase the diversity, increase individuals, but we will still maintain our current process throughout this process.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good.
This is another avenue for us to pick up individuals.
Great, thanks. And Ian, I want to ask you one question I didn't ask you when we had spoke individually. What's your firefighter experience?
Well, I'm 19 years in the fire service. I started with an independent district, BLS Fire Department, and I mean, I can give you the whole story, but as I started to take classes, I realized there was more to the fire service than I was going to get there. So I looked at the metros in my area, applied, went to paramedic school. The irony I'll share with the board candidly is I never wanted to be a paramedic, and now my whole world is paramedics. But it was one of the best decisions I ever made that I didn't know was going to be a good decision. So now I currently work at a metro department. I run our EMS division.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you, Ian. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hill?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you for that great presentation. And I agree, Mayor, that as we move into the 21st century, we always talk about 21st century policing, but we haven't quite addressed 21st century firefighting and how that model look. And I think we're coming close to that. What I love that this is data-driven. This is a knee-jerk reaction. And there were some things and I'd like to commend you, Chief, for your leadership and your vision, and also your men and women of OFD. It sounds as if there's nothing really broke at OFD. We're leading the nation when it comes to standards and firefighting. But as the city grows, we're really addressing the growth in this city and trying to maintain the standards of service that we have that's leading the nation. What I do also love about this plan is, I know it might be a small concern to you, Commissioner Stewart, but coming from the medical field, most nurses are physical therapists aren't nurses in the beginning. Usually they come in through a different department, whether it was lab techs, whether it was CNAs or HOAs, and what it does is it exposes them to that environment, and there's nothing like on-the-job training versus book training. So I think this is an avenue to where I think the chief stated earlier, as we look to this 21st century OFD, and I also like to thank OPD, where they're doing it when we start talking about diversity and their model looking like the community. We are a great melting pot here in the city of Orlando, and through the decades, OFD is mostly majority male and white. And in order to balance that is to now put a model like this in place where we're bringing in women that might not be EMS qualified yet or firefighter qualified, but at least bringing them into the door so that we can start grooming and balancing out our department and creating diversity. The other part that I can appreciate is the fact that there will be no firefighters laid off, which is very, very important, that no families will be disrupted economically, and that our men and women that have stood in the gap for so long during this overtime and creating that gap, and I think, as you stated, sometime missing time with their families, now they'll be able to spend that quality time with families.
I want to make sure I state this again. Our goal is to make sure we lessen the load on our firefighters. They do a great job. Again, we're one of the top in the country, but it's a ceiling that we're going to hit at some point, and the workload is increasing. It's challenging for our firefighters to run these transport calls and among other fire calls. So my goal is to balance the workload for them to make sure their work-life balance is even better than what they are today.
So thank you all for the work that you do at OFD, and I really think this is a great vision plan. Hopefully we'll be able to implement it, and I think it has served the city well. And then when we start talking about sustainability going into this 21st century. But the workload, for sure, I think here it is. When we look down in Lake Nona every day, there's something on council where they're building. More families are moving into our downtown Orlando and throughout the city, and we're going to need more workload, especially when it's civilian driven, just for transport. Seems like that's the bulk of our workload here in the city. So with that being said, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Sheehan.
Thank you, Mayor. And something that I frequently hear, even from the firefighters themselves, is about the jokes about the unequal workload between stations. So I think it's important to, to even that out so that everybody's getting a chance to, to share in the to the experience. Something that my constituents frequently complain about is the tower trucks that slip and falls in the grocery store, because they see that's something very. That's something that they see, and they don't understand why a tower truck and all these large equipment, while this large equipment has to be, dispatched to something like that. So I think from a constituent standpoint, this is something that's just common sense and makes sense, and I think they will be very appreciative of seeing that cost savings. I also think that adding EMS staff during peak just makes sense, because something that I'm hearing from my constituents as well is the ones who have survived heart attack or something like that as the result of the quick response times. So that's something that we're really doing right, and we need to make sure that we bolster that. I just had a question. I was a little confused between page 23 and 24. It says, on page 23, it says there's a potential for $2 million in savings, but on page 24, it says a conservative estimate of $384,000 in deficit. So I'm just trying to reconcile those two slides to exactly what that means.
Yeah, I'm sorry. On page 23, that's referring to what we believe the transport revenues could increase.
Okay.
Transport revenues could increase between 1.6 to 2.2 million.
Okay.
And
but
then,
there's still going to be a deficit potentially.
Potentially
Okay.
on the conservative side. So if we take that conservative 1.6 million,
Yeah.
there could be a deficit. But if we take what we think is probably more realistic, is the higher tier of that 2 to 2.2 million, then there wouldn't.
Okay, but if we continue the current practices, that's going to be even higher, that deficit.
You talking about the 385? It stabilizes the model because it allows you to kind of assume control over what's happening. And that was kind of the point we were making with the 385. Even if your transport revenues end up on the bottom end of what we project they could be, so you're 385 in the hole, you're still kind of controlling your fate at that point. The model with the third-party provider only getting that 7,700 calls piece of the pie at the BLS side, it's difficult for them to sustain from a business practice.
Right.
So there's likely going to be some conversation about how you guys can help them make up that gap. And what we're saying is that delta would likely be bigger than what you would even experience here on the negative side. So
Well,
it's the lesser of two evils.
Those are the services the government provides, the stuff that won't make money.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
right.
Ray says privatize government.
That's why
but
government
we
does
provide
it.
services that don't make money. There's a reason for that.
Exactly.
So, okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Ortiz?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a couple of questions. Just to verify that, or to clarify, when you talk about units on page 3, we're referring to people, not vehicles. Get confused because in law enforcement, when we're talking about a unit, we're talking about a police car going with a police officer. But in firefighters, you have a vehicle with different people, with multiple amount of people in a vehicle. So what are we talking about when you talk about units?
Here on page 3 with the community demand units, we're talking about the vehicle.
The vehicle.
Yeah. So if it's a rescue truck, it's 2 people. If it's an engine, it could be 3 to 4, or truck is 4.
All right. The second question I had for you was, what's the national firefighter to city population ratio? Do you know?
It's all over the grid. Some agents.
I mean, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I guess the question comes, with this program, what would be the ratio compared to the program without, I mean, to the current program that we have?
Well, we did not run your ratio, but when you're talking only reducing 8 on the minimum staffing daily, it's likely statistically not enough to move the needle on that.
I think we have about 1.9, 1.92.
Yeah, because those ratios are based off of the amount of firefighters you employ, not your minimum staffing. So really the ratio wouldn't change at all because you're still employing the same number of firefighters you employ now. So your ratio would be the same with the minimum staffing adjustment as it is today.
And Commissioner, I haven't looked in a little while, but the last time I looked, we had the highest number of firefighters per 1,000 and highest number of police officers per 1,000 of any of the big cities in the state of Florida.
We have about 1.9 firefighters per 1,000 citizens. But the reason why I ask is because I want to see the efficiency, how this applies in terms of the efficiency, what this is going to create later on, maybe not now, but as our population keeps increasing, how's that going to help us either maintain the same amount of firefighters or increasing, or what's going to be the need by adopting this particular system compared to maintaining what we currently have?
Yeah. Well, the advantage here is it allows you to get surgical and specific about your community. One of the challenges with doing those types of community-by-community comparisons is what's often missing from that conversation is the risk piece. So the risk in every community can vary dramatically. It's your socioeconomic demographics, it's the age of your population, it's the age of your infrastructure, you know. How many of your buildings are protected and how many of your buildings were built pre-fire protection codes. So it's very difficult to give an apples-to-apples comparison of the ratio. What we do is we like to come into the community and understand your risk so that whatever we're giving you as an efficiency is truly catered and it surgically addresses your risk to give you, really the goal is to maximize your efficiencies and still address your risk inside the community. So as you grow and your risks changes, it really is going to have to be customized for your agency. I mean, the comparison's always good to give you a barometer of where you sit. But you know, our recommendation is to always look internally at your community risk and cater it to that need.
Thank you. Chief, one last question. This one is for you. You talk about bringing minorities in, to this new system and whatnot. This is going to bring us, or afford us an opportunity to kind of, how much have we changed from years ago in terms of representing the community? Here we go again, ratios.
Well, current OF today is, like I said, 3%, right at 4% female, 8%, a little over 8% for African American, 11% Latino. So in the other Asians mixed in that population, when you looked at the city as a whole, we're not reflective of that. What I'm suggesting here in this is just gives us an opportunity to add to our current department using another conduit other than our standard testing process. And I truly believe when I look at the neighboring department where their numbers have went from 8% to over 20-some% female in the last couple of years because of a process such as this. So it is a proven model. It's an opportunity for us to I won't say take advantage of it, but number one, give back to this community, and if we can find the right people, regardless, what their sex, what their color is, they're good people and they fit OFD model, we can bring them on the right way, kind of test drive them for 3 years or so, and then bring them on the right way.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mayor.
Chief, this is some fairly substantial changes in the potential operation of the fire department. So I see Ron and Bernie and a number of the members of the E-Board and other firefighters here. And I think I understand that you have a meeting with the E-Board this afternoon to go over some of what we've talked about this morning. And I've had the benefit of having this presentation 3 times, I think, so I have a pretty good handle on it. But I want to make sure that you develop a pretty good internal communication plan so that everybody has an understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Absolutely. That's one thing we have to do. Again, I talked to Ron a while ago about what was happening. And again, we haven't had an opportunity to sit down. Today we will with the consultant to go through more in depth in their concerns. Hopefully we can address them over the next couple of months. Again, we almost a year out from this program, 6 to 8 months of being implemented if everything goes well. But we still have a lot of work behind the scenes to do with the local, and I'm looking forward to working with them so we can get it done.
Okay, and could you go over your timeline, optimal timeline for implementation?
I hate to say it, but optimal timeline would be by the first quarter of next year. So October is in a perfect world, but January would be great too. So either way, but we have some other things we have to do as far as getting all the particulars behind the scenes addressed, making sure we're working with the local union, make sure their needs are addressed, and we can come to some common ground before implementation. We want this program to succeed, not just for us, for the department and for our citizens. So it takes a partnership. It's going to take definitely a partnership from the local and our members. So.
Okay, thank you, Chief.
All right, thank you.
That'll conclude our workshop for the day.